hearing has such a
Okay.
low number here?
Because that's 1 year of students only at Queens who have disclosed to the office. So I wouldn't know about the students who don't disclose because they didn't come in. But any of those, that category would include people with all of those accommodations that you mentioned. So we would have had all of those services provided in one degree or another in 1 year for 11 students who disclosed. If they don't disclose, I can't help them because I don't know.
Yeah, or they don't know,
Yeah.
right? Again,
So
it's
that's
about
why I'm
awareness,
here.
right? And outreach, and the numbers will
Yeah.
increase.
So this is called outreach. You were all going to go out there and tell people about what's available in the post-secondary sector. Pam?
Just a quick question, Barbara, you don't have to go into detail. Are other institutions in other provinces similar in the way that they're doing?
They're very similar, yeah. I mean, our national association, when we get together every year, yeah, the protocol, the basic principles, the compliance with the post-secondary offices have to comply with their provincial codes. Yeah, that's all very similar, yeah. Whoops. I skipped through the funding fund because I just mentioned along the way that we're funded centrally in Ontario, so the ministry provides what's called the Accessibility Enhancement Envelope to all post-secondary institutions. We report annually on that, and I think we're the only province in the country that has that luxury. So, Bob, that's why we have nirvana, but I think all my students would not quite call it nirvana, but you know, any system that's great also has problems. So I'm very grateful to work in this system, but that doesn't mean it's perfect. So what we look at is challenging creativity while maintaining academic integrity. And so that's the purpose of the whole thing. But what happens when we disagree? So you get the student comes in, they say, you know what, in high school I had unlimited time on exams. Why won't you give me that now? Which we won't. So we developed a pilot project to look at dispute resolution because it isn't always nirvana. PACT is the Post-Secondary Accessibility Consulting Team, and it's what's called a RARC pilot project. What is the RARC? The Regional Assessment and Resource Center was one of the outfalls of that learning disability funding. They established a resource center for assessment. There are two. One is in Kingston, one is in Sudbury. And so the center established this pilot project to look at mediation of disputes in post-secondary education. I'm just going to say briefly why we thought this was a good thing to do. Because we're seeing an awful lot of people, and I think this is one of the key frame this takeaway message. The transition from secondary to post-secondary is a big one. Because we're under different legislation, because we're accommodating different kinds of programs, things are different. And I think that's very disconcerting for parents, particularly, and for their students to walk in and find that there's a big difference in what universities, although we can offer a lot, where we draw the lines, okay? So what we're finding is that people come in from secondary saying, I expect to have the same accommodations that I had in high school, and the universities and colleges say, I'm sorry, we can't do that here, and these are the bona fide reasons or the essential requirements that your accommodation would compromise. So because there's a juxtaposition there in that expectation, there's a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of dispute starts right there with people coming in with high school expectations and universities having to say no. And so instead of letting that become adversarial and people going to the Human Rights Commission and calling in their lawyers and everybody arguing, we thought, it would be really great if you could sit down with a third party, not from the institution and not of the students hiring, and try to come up with a solution that does work in a mediation model. So to bring down some of that ambient tension and offer people an alternative expert to talk to them about their accommodations before it becomes a problem. The other place we find it is when students disagree with their institution and they go up through the chain, what we find is if you go up through the academic chain to the dean and the associate dean and the academic appeals and all of that, those folks don't get the duty to accommodate. And if you go up the commission chain, those folks don't get the academic integrity thing around post-secondary education and professional education. So neither of the usual routes really offer an informed blend of accommodation planning in post-secondary. So we decided to develop PACT, which was a consulting project to look at informing both sides of the coin from outside the institution before they become adversarial, and if necessary, to go in and mediate the dispute. So that was the impetus for the pilot project. So the goal was to look at third-party documentation. Oh, it comes up from the bottom. Okay. So we wanted to create a panel of experts who would review documentation. So your question about ADHD and other disability documentation, when the school and the student disagree about whether it's adequate, we wanted to call in a third party to look at that. So we have both accommodation experts. We called somebody from outside of Ontario who does accommodation planning to talk about the accommodation piece. And we have a panel of medical experts who will look at the documentation and tell us what more information is required here to form a good accommodation plan. Not just whether this is or isn't a disability, but what would help this process define more of the need so that you can actually plan around it. And to get some additional perspective for the student and their institution to problem solve that with. Another goal we had was about enhancing the consistency of accommodation. So when people develop an accommodation plan, it doesn't necessarily carry from one institution to another. And in post-secondary, students will take a course here, and they'll take a letter of permission there, and they'll go abroad, and they'll take another course, and it all comes together eventually, but it's not always the same accommodation game from one place to another. So we wanted to improve that by looking at what are some of the best practices. What are people most commonly doing and informing each other about that, and our National Association works towards that as well. And developing a guideline or tool for more consistent accommodation planning. And that's what the decision tree that I just showed you is about. So with the Alternative Dispute Resolution Service is a big part of this project. So we wanted to look at that and providing a facilitator to assist in developing those solutions so that you get an early intervention problem. As soon as the service provider or the student says, I'm not so sure about this, you're not really understanding, I'm not really going to go with that accommodation. That's the moment where we want students to call us, parents to call us, or the service provider to call us and say, we're just not sure we're going to be able to agree here before it gets any more difficult. It's informal, it's not binding, you can talk to us, you can find out another perspective, you can get some ideas, you can go with it or not. But it's collaborative as opposed to being adversarial. We wanted to do some training and support to help service providers become more familiar with some of the principles in accommodation planning. Not that they're not, but you know, the human rights stuff is an ever-moving target, and different cases bring up different questions, so we wanted to build that capacity. To be able to respond to both formal and informal inquiries, providing resources to the disability offices, and developing resource materials for students in the community and their parents. So we have on our website a link that gives people some basic information at this point, but we're looking at building some resources there so people can have, say, examples of accommodation that worked well, ideas for things that people have found in their practice that were successful. So building towards a positive exemplar that could be out there for people to draw on. So what we did is we conducted preliminary consultations. I went around